The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet Montana evening. Abigail Winters shrank into the corner of her father's dusty general store, pulling her worn shawl tight around her shoulders as another bottle crashed against the wall. The store smelled of whiskey, spilled flour, and old wood. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, turning the sky red. Inside, the only thing Abigail felt was fear. Her father stood in the middle of the store, swaying slightly, a bottle in one hand and rage in his eyes. "You'll never amount to anything," he shouted, his voice thick with drink. "Just like your mother. Weak. Useless." Abigail lowered her eyes. She had heard these words so many times they felt carved into her heart. She was 22 years old, yet she felt older than the mountains outside town. Whitehorn. But Montana in 1878 was not kind to the weak, and Abigail had been raised to believe she was exactly that. Her mother had died when Abigail was only 8. Since then, the store had become her world. She cooked, she cleaned, she worked behind the counter, and every day she listened to her father remind her how worthless she was. "Clean this mess," he growled, pointing at the broken glass before stumbling toward the door. "I'm going to the saloon." The bell above the door rang as he left. Silence filled the store. Abigail stayed still for several seconds, listening to his boots fade down the street. Only then did she slowly stand. The floor was covered with scattered goods. Nails had spilled across the wood like tiny pieces of silver rain. Broken jars glittered in the fading light. She knelt down and began picking them up. Small shards of glass cut into her fingers, but she ignored the pain. She had learned long ago that pain was easier than shame. Across the street, the Silver Dollar Saloon burst to life with piano music and loud laughter. Her father would stay there until morning, drinking away whatever money the store had made. Abigail finished cleaning and quietly closed the shop for the night. The next morning began before sunrise. She was already baking bread in the small kitchen behind the store when the bell above the door rang. The smell of fresh loaves filled the air. Her stomach tightened. She expected her father to stumble in drunk and angry. Instead, Sheriff Miller stepped inside. His gray mustache twitched as he removed his hat. "Miss Winters," he said gently, "I'm afraid I've got some hard news." Abigail's hands froze in the dough. What is it, Sheriff?" He hesitated. "There was a fight at the saloon last night. Cards. Accusations of cheating." Her heart began to pound. "Your father didn't survive." The room went quiet. Abigail felt the ground tilt beneath her. Not grief. She had mourned the father she wished she had years ago. What she felt now was something colder. Fear. "What happens now?" she whispered. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's the other matter." He cleared his throat. "Your father owed the bank a lot of money. Mr. Hargrove now owns the store and the building." Abigail stared at him. "Everything?" "I'm afraid so." The sheriff sighed. "He's giving you until the end of the week to leave." After he left, Abigail stood alone in the center of the store. At 22 years old, she had nothing. No home, no family, no future. For 3 days, she moved like a ghost through Whitehorn. She buried her father. She packed her small belongings, and she listened to the quiet whispers of townspeople who kept their distance. On the third evening, Mr. Hargrove himself arrived. He was a round man, with small eyes and a smile that felt wrong. "You'll be leaving tomorrow, I assume?" he said, looking around the store like it was already his. "Yes," Abigail answered stiffly. He stepped closer. "A young woman alone can face many dangers on the frontier." His gaze slid across her in a way that made her stomach turn. "My wife could use help in our household. You'd have a roof over your head." Abigail knew what the offer meant. She had heard the rumors. "Thank you," she said carefully. "But I have other plans." His smile tightened. "Well, if those plans fail, my door is open." After he left, Abigail sank onto a crate. She had no plans. None at all. The next morning, she walked out of Whitehorn with a single carpet bag. No one noticed. No one stopped her. She followed the dusty road out of town with nowhere to go. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Worthless. Useless. Nothing. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky. Her feet hurt, and her throat burned with thirst. Finally, she stopped beside a small creek and drank from the cold water. As she sat on a fallen log, the weight of loneliness crushed down on her, and she was completely alone. The sound of hooves broke the silence. Abigail stiffened. A rider appeared around the bend in the road. Her heart jumped when she recognized him. The man from the livery stable. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her. "Afternoon, miss," he said calmly. She gripped her bag tighter. "I'm traveling." He studied her worn shoes and small bag. "Traveling where?" "The next town." "Silver Creek?" She nodded. He shook his head. "That's 20 miles." Her stomach dropped. "You won't reach it before dark." "I'll manage," she said quickly. The man swung down from his horse. He was tall and broad-shouldered. "Name's Ethan Lawson," he said. "I've got a ranch a few miles back. My housekeeper could use help. Plenty of room." Every warning her father had ever given her screamed in her mind. "I'll continue on my way," she said firmly. Ethan nodded. "Fair enough." He glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were rolling across the mountains. "Storm coming, though." Large drops of rain began falling. Ethan stepped back. "I'll ride ahead a bit," he said. "If you change your mind, holler." He rode down the road. Abigail stood frozen. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began pouring down. Her thin shawl was soaked in seconds. Desperation pushed the words from her mouth. "Mr. Lawson!" He turned his horse. "I would appreciate that ride." Ethan smiled slightly and rode back. Without hesitation, he secured her bag to the saddle. Then he placed his hands gently on her waist and lifted her onto the horse. The sudden closeness made her breath catch. "I can ride alone," she said quickly. "I know you can," he replied. "But we've got to outrun this storm." He swung up behind her and gathered the reins. The horse surged forward into the rain. Wind whipped around them. Abigail clung to the saddle as the horse galloped across the open prairie. Behind them, thunder cracked across the sky. Ethan leaned close so she could hear him over the storm. "Hold on," he said softly. His arms surrounded her as he guided the horse through the rain. For the first time in her life, Abigail felt something strange. Safe. Minutes later, a large ranch house appeared through the rain. Warm light glowed in the windows. They rode into the yard and stopped beneath the porch. Ethan helped her down gently. For a moment, she stood in his arms, stunned. Rain ran down her face as she looked up at him. His blue eyes studied her quietly. "You're safe here," he said. And Abigail Winters had no idea that this moment, this storm, and this cowboy were about to change her entire life forever. Ethan led Abigail onto the porch while rain poured from the dark sky behind them. An older woman hurried out of the house, her gray hair pinned tight and her apron already damp from the wind. "Ethan Lawson, what are you doing out in this storm?" she scolded. Then her eyes softened when she saw Abigail. "And who is this poor girl?" "Miss Abigail Winters," Ethan said. "She was headed to Silver Creek on foot. Storm caught her." The woman gasped. "On foot? Child, you'd have frozen by nightfall." She gently pulled Abigail inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like something she had never known. A large stone fireplace glowed in the center of the room. The floors were polished. The air smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread. It felt nothing like the dark store she had left behind. "I'm Mrs. Cooper," the woman said. "You're safe here." "Yea." The word echoed inside Abigail. Mrs. Cooper led her upstairs to a guest room with a wide bed and a colorful quilt. A real mirror stood against the wall. Clean towels waited neatly folded. "You change into this," Mrs. Cooper said, handing her a soft nightgown. "Dinner in an hour." Left alone, Abigail stared at her reflection. She looked small, thin, uncertain, worthless. The word rose again like a ghost. She changed into the borrowed gown and returned downstairs. Ethan had also changed into a clean shirt. He stood when she entered the dining room. That simple gesture made her pause. No man had ever stood for her before. Dinner was warm and hearty. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread. Ethan spoke gently. "What took you out of Whitehorn?" Abigail hesitated. "My father passed," she said quietly. "The bank took everything. I had nowhere to stay." She waited for pity, or worse. Instead, Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. That's not easy." Mrs. Cooper shook her head. "You'll stay here until you decide your next step." Abigail looked up quickly. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Ethan said calmly. "Mrs. Cooper could use help around the house. Room and wages. Fair work." She searched his face for something hidden. She found nothing but steady honesty. "Why?" she asked. Because helping people matters," he answered simply, "and because I can see you're capable." Capable. The word felt unfamiliar. "I'll work," she said firmly. "I earn what I'm given." Ethan smiled. "That's exactly why I'm offering." And just like that, Abigail stayed. Days turned into weeks. She woke before sunrise, cooked for the ranch hands, cleaned the house, tended the garden, mended shirts. The work was hard, but it felt different from the store. Here, when she did something well, someone thanked her. Ethan always thanked her. He never raised his voice. He never made her feel small. One afternoon, the black stallion broke loose from the corral. Abigail was hanging laundry when the powerful horse charged across the yard. Fear shot through her chest. Then Ethan stepped between her and the horse. He did not shout. He did not whip. He spoke low and steady. "Easy, Midnight. No one's going to hurt you." The stallion slowed. It lowered its head. Abigail stared in amazement. "You trust him," she said softly. "Trust has to be earned," Ethan replied. The words stayed with her long after the moment passed. Trust had never existed in her childhood. One evening, Ethan led her up a small rise behind the ranch. An oak tree stood alone against the sky. They sat beneath it as the sun dipped below the mountains. Gold and orange light stretched across the land. "This is my favorite place," Ethan said. "My father used to bring me here." Abigail watched the sky shift into deep purple. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You deserve beautiful things," Ethan said without looking at her. The simple statement struck her deeper than any grand speech, and she felt tears gather but forced them back. "I was told most of my life I didn't deserve much," she admitted quietly. Ethan turned to her fully. "Who told you that?" "My father." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He was wrong." She shook her head quickly. "You don't know that." "I do," he said firmly. "I've seen you work. I've seen your strength. I've seen your kindness. You are not worthless, Abigail." The word hung between them. Worthless. For the first time, someone had spoken against it, and she believed him. A week later, Ethan was thrown from a horse while working cattle. Abigail ran when she saw him brought back to the house, pale and barely breathing steady. She boiled water, wrapped bandages, sat by his bed through the night. When the house fell quiet, he looked at her from the dim lamplight. "You don't have to stay," he said softly. "I want to," she answered. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I care." The truth settled heavy and real between them. Over the next 2 weeks, she cared for him daily, changed bandages, brought meals, read to him. They talked about everything. He told her about building the ranch after his father passed. She told him about her mother, about the loneliness that followed. For the first time in her life, someone listened. One afternoon, he caught her hand as she adjusted his bandages. "I noticed you the first day," he said quietly. "You looked lost." But not broken," she swallowed. "I was broken." "No," he said gently. "You were hurting. There's a difference." Her heart pounded. In his room, in that soft afternoon light, something shifted between them. By midsummer, he was healed. One evening, they rode to Silver Creek together. On the ride home, they stopped beneath the oak tree again. The sky burned red as the sun set. Ethan took her hand. "Abigail," he said slowly, "these past months with you have been the best of my life." Her breath caught. "When I lifted you onto my horse that day," he continued, "I didn't know I was lifting my whole future." Her eyes filled with tears. "I love you," he said. The world seemed to stand still. "I love your strength. I love your heart. I love who you are." She felt the old fear rise. What if this was temporary? What if he changed? What if love disappeared like everything else had? He must have seen the doubt in her eyes. "You don't have to answer," he said gently. "I'll prove it. I'll wait." She stepped closer. "I've been falling in love with you since that storm," she whispered. His smile broke across his face like sunrise. "You were never worthless," he said firmly. "Not then. Not ever." Tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, they were not tears of shame. He cupped her face carefully. "May I kiss you?" "Yes." His kiss was soft, steady, safe. When they pulled apart, the world felt different, brighter, stronger, alive. Later that night on the porch swing, Ethan looked at her with complete certainty. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "Not just as my housekeeper, as my wife." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Will you marry me, Abigail Winters?" She did not hesitate. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms. "I promise you something," he whispered against her hair. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." Abigail held him tightly. The girl who had walked out of Whitehorn believing she was nothing was gone. In her place stood a woman who was loved, and for the first time in her life, she felt like someone's world. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small white church in Silver Creek. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, lighting up the wooden pews and the simple altar at the front. Ranch hands, who usually looked rough and sunburned, stood stiff in borrowed jackets, hats clutched tightly in their hands. Mrs. Cooper sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she insisted she did not need. Abigail stood near the doorway for a quiet moment before walking down the aisle. Her dress was simple white cotton she had sewn herself. The tortoise-shell comb Ethan had bought her held a soft veil in place. She did not look like a grand bride from a city magazine. She looked like something far stronger. She looked certain. When Ethan saw her, his breath left him. His blue eyes shone in a way that made her heart steady instead of race. For so long she had felt small under the weight of harsh words. Now she walked toward a man who had only ever spoken truth and kindness to her. The preacher spoke briefly about partnership and faith. When he asked Ethan if he would cherish and protect her, His voice did not waver. "I will," he said. When he asked Abigail if she would stand beside Ethan in all seasons of life, she did not hesitate. "I will." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan pulled her gently into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that left no doubt in anyone watching. The ranch hands cleared their throats loudly and looked away, pretending not to wipe their eyes. Abigail had walked into that church as a woman who once believed she was nothing. She walked out as Abigail Lawson, wife, partner, chosen. Their life together began quietly, but steadily. Abigail took over more responsibility at the ranch house. She reorganized the kitchen, planted flower beds near the porch, and filled the rooms with warmth that had not been there before. Ethan never treated her as decoration. He asked her opinion on cattle purchases, on expansion plans, on hiring decisions. He listened when she spoke, and every time doubt flickered in her eyes, he caught it before it could grow. "You belong here," he would remind her. Months passed. Then one evening, beneath the oak tree that had witnessed their first confession of love, Ethan placed his hand over hers and smiled in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Are you certain?" she whispered. He nodded. "I've never been more certain of anything." A year later, Abigail held their newborn daughter in her arms. Emma Grace Lawson had her father's blue eyes and a fierce cry that filled the entire ranch house. Ethan stood beside the bed, staring down at the tiny life they had created together. "She will never doubt her worth," he said quietly. Abigail looked up at him. "No," she agreed. "She will grow up knowing she is wanted." Ethan bent and kissed her forehead. And loved. 2 years later, their son James was born strong and loud, his tiny fingers wrapping tightly around Ethan's thumb, as if claiming him from the very start. The ranch grew with them. New barns were built. More cattle filled the pastures. Children's laughter replaced the lonely silence that once haunted the halls. Abigail often watched her children run through the tall grass and felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Her childhood had been filled with harsh words and cold rooms. Theirs was filled with warmth and open skies. But one evening on their 10th anniversary, Ethan led her back to the corral. Midnight, now older and calm, stood beside a young black filly with bright, curious eyes. "She's yours," Ethan said. Abigail touched the young horse gently. "For me?" "For the woman who rode into my life in a storm," he replied. She smiled softly. "What will you name her?" he asked. Abigail thought of the creek, of the storm, of the way she had once stood alone and frightened. "Hope," she said finally. Ethan nodded. "Perfect." That night, beneath the oak tree, they sat side by side while their children slept in the house below. The ranch stretched out before them in the moonlight. Ethan turned toward her, his expression serious. "Do you remember the day I lifted you onto my horse?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I remember thinking I had no choice." He laughed softly. "I remember thinking I had just found the woman who would change my life." She looked at him, eyes shining. "You called me your world," she said. He did not deny it. "You are my world," he answered. "You and these children, this life, all of it." Abigail rested her head against his shoulder. For years, she had believed she was nothing, that she carried no value, that she was a burden waiting to be discarded. Now she knew the truth. Worth was not decided by the anger of a bitter man. It was revealed by love. Ethan had not created her value. He had simply helped her see what had always been there. As the wind moved gently through the tall grass, Abigail closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of home. She was not the frightened girl from Whitehorn anymore. She was a wife, a mother, a partner, a woman whose laughter filled a house built on respect. And whenever she rode across the ranch beside Ethan, her black mare strong beneath her, and her children racing ahead in the open field, she felt the truth settle deep inside her bones. She had once believed she was worthless, but a cowboy had lifted her onto his horse during a storm, held her steady through the rain, and spoken words that changed everything. He had called her his world, and in doing so, he had given her the courage to claim her own.